The year was 1540, and beneath the glittering facade of Hampton Court Palace, a horror story was unfolding that would make even the most twisted fairy tale seem tame by comparison. While courtiers danced and diplomats smiled, one woman found herself trapped in a nightmare of royal cruelty that began not with treason or adultery, but with something far more devastating in the eyes of a Tudor king. She had failed to arouse his desire. Anne of Cleves arrived in England as a bride, a diplomatic prize meant to secure Protestant alliances and strengthen Henry VIII against his Catholic enemies. What she became was something far more sinister, a living symbol of royal contempt, a woman whose only crime was existing in the wrong body at the wrong time. This is not the sanitized story of the lucky wife who kept her head. This is the brutal truth of systematic humiliation, calculated cruelty, and a king whose own rotting flesh projected its corruption onto an innocent woman. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most misunderstood royal disasters. The tale of how Henry VIII transformed a respectable German princess into a figure of ridicule, and how she survived by accepting degradation that would have broken lesser souls. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Anne of Cleves represents not just personal tragedy, but the complete moral bankruptcy of Tudor England itself. But before we witness the destruction of a woman's dignity, we need to understand the monster who orchestrated it. By 1539, Henry VIII had become something barely recognizable as human. The athletic young king who had once dazzled European courts was now a walking corpse, his massive frame supported by mechanical aids, his legs weeping pus and blood through silk stockings. The sweet smell of decay followed him through palace corridors as courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths in his presence. Medical experts analyzing contemporary accounts paint a horrifying picture. Henry likely suffered from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that would have caused excruciating agony while producing foul-smelling discharge from multiple wound sites. His physicians, operating without understanding of bacterial infection, could only bandage the wounds and prescribe opium that further clouded his already unstable judgment. The combination of physical torment and narcotic medication created a ruler who was both dangerous and completely unpredictable. The king's medical condition affected far more than just his mobility. The chronic infection likely disrupted his hormones and circulation in ways that made intimate relations difficult or impossible. Yet Henry's massive ego prevented any acknowledgement of these medical realities. Instead, he blamed his wives for his own physical limitations, creating elaborate psychological defenses that transformed medical symptoms into moral judgments about feminine adequacy. This was the diseased tyrant who would soon pass judgment on Anne of Cleves, projecting his own bodily corruption onto a woman whose only failing was her inability to restore his shattered masculinity through sheer force of attraction. Meanwhile, across the Channel in the German Duchy of Cleves, a 24-year-old woman was preparing for the role of her lifetime. Anne had been raised in the disciplined court of her brother, Duke Wilhelm, educated in languages, music, and the diplomatic graces expected of noble wives. She understood duty above personal feelings, a trait that would prove both her salvation and her curse in the treacherous world of Tudor politics. The political necessity driving this marriage cannot be overstated. England stood isolated in Europe, threatened by the Catholic alliance between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Henry's break with Rome had cost him crucial allies, and his realm teetered on the edge of diplomatic catastrophe. The Protestant German states offered salvation, and Anne represented the key to this alliance. Her brother commanded respect among Lutheran princes, making this marriage not romantic theatre, but a matter of national survival. Yet even as diplomats negotiated treaties and dowries, Henry's personal anxieties were already poisoning the arrangement. The once confident king now struggled with deep insecurities about his physical decline. He demanded constant validation of his desirability while simultaneously becoming less capable of the intimate performance that might justify such validation. The stage was set for disaster before Anne ever set foot on English soil. The first crack in this doomed union came through art itself. Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne sealed her fate before they ever met. The court painter, renowned for his unflinching realism, had captured the Duchess in traditional Germanic attire, her face serene and dignified beneath an elaborate headdress. To modern eyes, she appears pleasant, even attractive, but Henry's expectations had been inflamed by diplomatic flattery and his own desperate need for validation. The king studied that portrait obsessively, building fantasies that no mortal woman could fulfill. His courtiers, understanding exactly what their monarch wanted to hear, embellished the painting's promise with elaborate descriptions of Germanic beauty and virtue. They spoke of skin like fresh cream and eyes that sparkled with intelligence, creating an impossible standard that would doom Anne before she ever reached England. When Anne's entourage finally reached English shores in December 1539, they brought with them the hopes of two nations and the weight of Protestant alliance. The Duchess herself had prepared for months to become Queen of England. She had studied English customs, practiced the language, and even learned new dance steps to please her royal husband. Her dowry chests overflowed with Germanic treasures that represented her family's wealth and status. The meeting at Rochester shattered all illusions in a single, catastrophic moment. Henry, disguised as a humble messenger in what he believed to be romantic courtly tradition, burst into Anne's chambers expecting to surprise and delight his bride. Instead, he encountered a woman who failed to recognize him, and worse still, failed to swoon at his presence. Anne, raised in the more formal Germanic court, responded with polite confusion rather than passionate recognition. This cultural misunderstanding became the first crack in their doomed relationship. Where Henry expected instant attraction and grateful submission, he found dignified bewilderment. The woman before him, foreign and unfamiliar, failed to validate his carefully constructed mythology of irresistible masculinity. Henry's immediate revulsion was palpable and witnessed by everyone present. His face darkened with barely contained fury as political necessity crashed against personal pride. In that moment, Anne became not just a disappointment, but an active threat to his self-image. The marriage would proceed because diplomatic obligations demanded it, but Henry's cruel campaign against Anne's reputation began that very day. The whispers started immediately. Courtiers who had praised the coming union now murmured about the bride's foreign ways, her unfamiliarity with English customs, her failure to meet their sovereign's refined expectations. These weren't spontaneous reactions, but calculated acts of political theatre designed to provide Henry with justification for his own inadequacies. The wedding ceremony on January 6, 1540, unfolded like a funeral masquerading as a celebration. Henry stood resplendent in cloth of gold despite his deteriorating health, while Anne wore magnificent robes that could not disguise the king's obvious disgust. Foreign diplomats strained to interpret the subtle signs of royal displeasure that rippled through Westminster Abbey's ancient stones. Anne herself maintained regal composure despite the humiliation brewing around her. Trained in Germanic court discipline, she understood duty above personal feelings. Yet she could not have comprehended the depths of English court cruelty that awaited her. This was not a celebration of love or political alliance, but the public degradation of a woman who had committed no crime beyond failing to enchant a diseased tyrant. That night, the royal bedchamber became a theatre of shame that would define Anne's entire experience in England. Henry, whose body now resembled a walking corpse more than a virile king, approached the marriage bed with all the enthusiasm he might reserve for his own execution. His leg ulcers, wrapped in stinking bandages, leaked through silk sheets while he blamed Anne for his own physical revulsion. The consummate performer who had charmed courts across Europe found himself impotent before a woman whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unable to acknowledge his own decay, Henry crafted a narrative of feminine inadequacy that would echo through history books for centuries. He complained to his physicians about Anne's body, invented stories about her smell, and suggested ways that her foreign somehow corrupted his natural masculine responses. These lies, whispered in royal chambers and repeated by sycophantic courtiers, transformed a woman's dignity into public entertainment for a court that thrived on others' misfortune. The systematic destruction of Anne's reputation had begun in earnest, and it would only accelerate as Henry's own condition worsened and his need for scapegoats grew more desperate. The court's treatment of Anne revealed the systematic cruelty that defined Tudor governance at its most vicious. Within days of the wedding, courtiers who had once competed for her attention now mocked her Germanic accent with theatrical exaggeration. They ridiculed her unfamiliarity with English customs, turning every cultural difference into evidence of her fundamental inadequacy as a queen. Even her choice of perfumes became fodder for cruel jokes whispered behind painted fans. Ladies-in-waiting, those supposed companions and confidants, transformed into spies and saboteurs. They reported every perceived flaw to Henry's eager ears with the dedication of professional torturers. The Queen found herself isolated in a nest of vipers, where survival meant enduring daily humiliations with silent grace, while her every movement was scrutinized for signs of foreign corruption. Henry's courtiers understood their role in this elaborate performance of royal displeasure. To curry favor with their increasingly unstable monarch, they competed to devise new insults and observations that would validate his rejection of Anne. Her clothing became too foreign, her manners too Germanic, her very presence an offense against English sensibilities. These attacks were not spontaneous expressions of xenophobia, but calculated acts of political theatre designed to provide Henry with the justification he desperately craved. The transformation from queen to scapegoat happened with terrifying speed. Within weeks, Anne had become a living symbol of everything wrong with foreign influence in English politics. Pamphlets appeared suggesting that Germanic women were inherently unsuitable for English men, while court poets crafted verses celebrating the superiority of native-born beauties. This propaganda campaign served a dual purpose, normalizing Henry's rejection while preparing public opinion for the annulment that everyone knew must come. Even worse than the public humiliation was the private torment inflicted by royal physicians who examined Anne's body for evidence of the defects Henry claimed to perceive. These intimate violations, conducted under the guise of medical necessity, represented the ultimate degradation of a woman who had entered England as an honoured guest and ally. The reports from these examinations, carefully crafted to support Henry's narrative, would be preserved in royal records as evidence of Anne's unsuitability. Henry's physicians, terrified of suggesting that royal health might be compromised, collaborated in blaming external factors for the king's obvious decline. They diagnosed Anne with imaginary conditions, suggesting that Germanic humours, or foreign dietary habits, had somehow corrupted the king's natural vitality. These medical opinions show how professional knowledge was subordinated to political necessity in Tudor England. The progression of Henry's illness can be tracked through diplomatic accounts that note his increasing isolation and erratic behaviour. By 1540, foreign ambassadors reported that audiences with the king required extensive preparation to mask the smell of his infected wounds. English courtiers developed elaborate protocols for maintaining respectful distance during royal interactions, all while Anne bore the blame for the sovereign's evident physical corruption. While Anne endured her public crucifixion, Henry had already turned his predatory attention toward Catherine Howard, a teenage girl whose youth and inexperience promised the validation his ego desperately required. Catherine, barely out of childhood and overwhelmed by royal attention, became the instrument of Anne's final humiliation. The king's pursuit of his fifth wife began even before his fourth marriage had been formally dissolved, Catherine Howard represented everything Anne was not. Young where Anne was mature, English where Anne was foreign, inexperienced where Anne was educated. Her very existence served as a rebuke to Anne's adequacy, and Henry made sure his current queen understood this comparison. Court observers noted how the king's demeanour brightened whenever Catherine appeared, while his interactions with Anne became increasingly perfunctory and cold. The speed with which Henry pursued Catherine revealed the calculated nature of his rejection of Anne. This was not a gradual cooling of affection, but a deliberate campaign to justify a predetermined conclusion. Henry had decided to rid himself of Anne almost immediately after their wedding, and Catherine Howard provided the perfect excuse for this decision. The young girl's eagerness to please would ultimately lead to her own destruction, but for now, she served as the weapon Henry wielded against his current wife's dignity. Anne's position became increasingly precarious as Henry's courtship of Catherine intensified. The Queen found herself attending court functions where her husband's new obsession was the centre of attention. Forced to smile and participate in her own replacement, royal etiquette demanded she maintain composure while witnessing her marriage dissolve in real time. The sophisticated diplomatic training that had prepared her to be queen now served only to help her manage her own destruction with grace. European courts watched Anne's treatment with fascination and horror, recognizing implications that extended far beyond one woman's personal tragedy. The Holy Roman Emperor used Anne's humiliation as evidence of English barbarism in his diplomatic correspondence, while French courtiers crafted elaborate entertainments, mocking Henry's inability to consummate his marriage with a decent German virgin. The Protestant German states viewed Anne's rejection as a personal insult that threatened the entire Reformation cause in Northern Europe. Duke Wilhelm of Cleves seriously considered breaking his alliance with England and joining the Catholic League against Henry, a move that would have left England completely isolated diplomatically. Only Anne's own letters urging patience and restraint prevented this catastrophic realignment that might have led to English invasion and conquest. Spanish ambassadors reported that Henry's treatment of Anne revealed fundamental instabilities in English royal succession that could be exploited for Catholic advantage. These reports show how Anne's personal tragedy became a factor in international military planning, with Catholic powers calculating that England's internal weaknesses made it vulnerable to reconquest for the true faith. The machinery of annulment began grinding forward with ruthless efficiency. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's marriage, now found himself tasked with its destruction, a cruel irony that would ultimately cost him his life. Legal scholars scoured canon law for precedents, while theologians crafted arguments about consummation and consent that would provide Henry with his desired freedom. Parliamentary committees investigated the marriage's validity with predetermined outcomes, interviewing witnesses who understood exactly what testimony would preserve their positions at court. Anne's foreign birth became evidence of impediments to valid marriage, while Henry's claims of non-consummation were accepted without question despite their obvious fabrication. The legal proceedings resembled show trials more than genuine inquiries. The most insidious aspect of the annulment process was how it transformed Anne's cooperation into further evidence of her inadequacy. When she agreed to testify about the marriage's non-consummation, court observers noted her unnatural willingness to discuss such intimate matters. When she remained silent about Henry's treatment, this was interpreted as proof of her foreign inability to understand English emotional expression. Religious authorities, terrified of contradicting Henry's will after witnessing the fates of Thomas More and John Fisher, provided eager theological justification for whatever the king desired. Bishops, who had once celebrated Anne's Protestant faith, now discovered impediments in her Germanic religious practices. The speed with which these learned men reversed their positions revealed the complete corruption of institutional integrity under Henry's reign. Anne's survival was not merely passive endurance, but an active campaign of intelligence gathering and strategic relationship building. During her brief marriage, she had quietly cultivated relationships with German merchants, Protestant reformers, and English nobles who viewed Henry's treatment of her as symptomatic of broader concerns about royal stability. These networks would prove crucial to her ultimate survival and prosperity. The Germanic merchant communities in London had watched Anne's humiliation with particular horror, understanding that her treatment reflected Henry's broader hostility toward foreign influence in English commerce. These merchants, who controlled significant portions of England's wool trade and banking systems, quietly supported Anne through advantageous property deals, favorable exchange rates, and information about political developments that might affect her security. Their support was subtle but crucial, providing her with economic independence that went far beyond Henry's official considerations. Anne's correspondence reveals a woman far more politically astute than history has recorded. She maintained careful communication with her brother, Duke Wilhelm, and other German princes, providing them with intelligence about English political developments while never crossing the line into outright espionage. This delicate balance required extraordinary diplomatic skill, as she had to appear loyal to English interests while secretly serving as an informal ambassador for Protestant German states. Her household at Richmond Palace became an unofficial embassy for German nationals seeking assistance in England. Anne provided legal advice, financial aid, and political protection for merchants, scholars, and refugees who found themselves vulnerable in Henry's increasingly xenophobic kingdom. These activities were conducted with such discretion that English authorities remained unaware of their extent, allowing Anne to build a power base that existed entirely outside official recognition or control. The terms of Anne's surrender were surprisingly generous, reflecting both Henry's relief at avoiding another bloody spectacle and his genuine fear of the political consequences of executing a Germanic princess. She would retain the title of the king's sister, receive substantial lands and income, and maintain a position of honor at court as long as she never challenged the annulment's validity. In exchange, she would publicly acknowledge that her marriage had never been valid, that she remained a virgin, and that Henry's rejection stemmed from legitimate canonical concerns rather than personal caprice. This bargain represented a masterpiece of political calculation on Anne's part. She had observed the fates of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, understanding that defiance led only to destruction, while submission offered the possibility of survival. Her Germanic upbringing had taught her to value practical outcomes over emotional satisfaction, making her uniquely suited to navigate Henry's treacherous court. Where other queens had chosen martyrdom or defiance, Anne chose pragmatic accommodation to power. The signing of the annulment agreement occurred with ceremonial dignity that masked its essential brutality. Anne, dressed in the rich robes her marriage had provided, formally renounced all claims to queenly status, while Henry's commissioners praised her wisdom and cooperation. The documents she signed contained clauses acknowledging her own inadequacy as a wife, her acceptance of Henry's version of events, and her gratitude for his merciful treatment of her situation. These forced confessions would become historical evidence of Anne's unfitness for marriage, cementing Henry's narrative for posterity. Foreign diplomats observed these proceedings with barely concealed horror, recognizing the implications for their own nation's relationships with England. If Henry VIII could so casually destroy a woman who had committed no crime beyond disappointing his personal expectations, what mercy could other foreign allies expect when political winds shifted? Anne's humiliation served as a warning to all European courts about the dangers of trusting Tudor promises or believing in English diplomatic integrity. On July 9th, 1540, the same day Parliament formally annulled Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. The minister who had arranged the Cleves alliance paid with his life for his diplomatic success, while Anne dined safely in her new estate at Richmond Palace. This cruel irony was lost on no one. The woman had survived by accepting humiliation, while the man who had served his king faithfully was destroyed for doing his job too well. Cromwell's death served multiple purposes in Henry's increasingly paranoid worldview. It provided a scapegoat for the diplomatic embarrassment of the Cleves marriage, satisfied public anger about foreign entanglements, and demonstrated royal power over even the highest-ranking officials. The minister's execution also conveniently eliminated the one person who knew all the details about how Henry's rejection of Anne had been orchestrated, taking those secrets to the grave and leaving only the official narrative of Anne's inadequacy for the historical record. The speed of Cromwell's fall from trusted advisor to executed traitor revealed the precarious nature of power under Henry VIII's reign. No service, however faithful, could guarantee survival when the king's ego required sacrifice. Anne, watching from her new home, understood that her own survival depended on remaining invisible and uncontroversial, never again attracting the dangerous attention that had destroyed so many others who had crossed Henry's path. Meanwhile, to Catherine Howard Proceed, Henry's marriage with obscene haste, taking place on the very day of Cromwell's execution. The juxtaposition was deliberate. Death and renewal, punishment and reward. The old order destroyed to make way for the new. Anne was expected to attend the wedding celebrations, to smile and offer congratulations to the girl who had replaced her, adding one final humiliation to her catalogue of sufferings under Tudor rule. Anne's transformation from queen to the king's sister represented a unique form of social resurrection in Tudor England. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who died in exile and disgrace, or Anne Boleyn, who met her end on the scaffold, Anne of Cleves found a way to maintain dignity and security despite her public rejection. Her new status, while humiliating in its origins, provided freedoms that queenship had never offered. Freedom from Henry's physical presence, from the constant surveillance of court life, and from the deadly politics that consumed so many of her contemporaries. Her estates provided not just economic security, but genuine independence rare for any woman in 16th century England. Anne could manage her own household, pursue her own interests, and live according to her own rhythms, without the crushing obligations that had defined her brief queenship. The irony was bitter, but undeniable. Rejection had liberated her from a fate that might well have ended in execution had she remained married to an increasingly unstable and dangerous king. Anne's management of her estates revealed business skills that contradicted contemporary assumptions about feminine capability in financial matters. She negotiated favorable leases, invested in agricultural improvements, and diversified her income through careful property management that increased her wealth substantially beyond Henry's original settlement. Her account books show a woman who understood complex economic relationships and managed her resources with sophisticated skill. Her investments in English agriculture introduced continental farming techniques that improved productivity on her estates, while providing employment for local populations who came to regard her as a benevolent and intelligent landlord. These innovations demonstrated practical intelligence that belied Henry's characterization of her as intellectually inferior, showing instead a woman who could successfully adapt Germanic knowledge to English conditions. Anne also invested in commercial ventures that connected English and German markets, using her unique position to facilitate trade relationships that benefited both kingdoms. Her involvement in the wool trade, textile manufacturing, and luxury goods importation created wealth that made her genuinely independent of royal favor, while contributing to English economic development in ways that contemporary chroniclers rarely acknowledged. Her financial success enabled charitable activities that further enhanced her reputation among ordinary English people who had initially accepted Henry's propaganda about her inadequacy. Anne funded schools, hospitals, and religious institutions that served local communities around her estates, creating genuine popular support that provided additional security against any potential political persecution. The court's treatment of Anne in her new role revealed the complex dynamics of Tudor social hierarchy. As the king's sister, she retained ceremonial precedence over most nobles while being quietly excluded from any real influence or power. She attended court functions when summoned, participated in royal celebrations when required, but remained essentially invisible to the political machinations that continued to swirl around Henry's court. This invisibility became her protection, allowing her to observe but never participate in the deadly games that consumed others. Foreign visitors often remarked on Anne's dignified bearing during these court appearances, noting how she managed to maintain composure despite the humiliating circumstances of her presence. She had mastered the art of being simultaneously visible and invisible, present enough to fulfill her ceremonial obligations, but insignificant enough to avoid attracting dangerous attention. This delicate balance required constant vigilance and self-control that testified to her remarkable strength of character. During her years as the king's sister, Anne underwent a remarkable personal transformation that demonstrated her resilience and adaptability. She mastered English completely, becoming fluent enough to conduct complex legal and financial negotiations without interpreters. Her household accounts show expenses for English tutors, music masters, and cultural instructors who helped her navigate the subtle requirements of English aristocratic society with increasing confidence. Anne developed genuine friendships with English noble families who admired her dignity and intelligence, creating social connections that existed entirely separate from her connection to Henry. The Howards, Seymours, and other prominent families invited her to private gatherings where she could participate in English court life without the formal constraints of royal protocol. These relationships provided emotional support and political protection that proved crucial during the dangerous transition periods that would follow Henry's death. Her interests expanded beyond mere survival to include patronage of scholars, artists, and religious reformers who appreciated her continental education and Protestant sympathies. Anne funded translation projects that brought German theological works into English, supported poets and musicians who had fled religious persecution in other parts of Europe, and maintained correspondence with humanist scholars across the continent who valued her intelligence and learning. The inventories of her personal possessions reveal a woman who had successfully synthesized German and English cultural elements into a unique personal style. Her clothing combined Germanic cut and fabric with English decorative elements, while her household furnishings blended continental craftsmanship with English comfort. This cultural synthesis represented not capitulation to English dominance, but creative adaptation that honored both her origins and her adopted home. Despite her official exclusion from political power, Anne wielded considerable informal influence through her network of relationships and her position as a neutral figure who could mediate between competing factions. English nobles seeking to communicate with continental allies often used Anne as an unofficial channel, trusting her discretion and valuing her linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge. This role gave her access to information and influence that many official courtiers lacked. During Edward VI's minority, Anne's Protestant credentials and continental connections made her valuable to reformist factions seeking to strengthen England's ties with German Lutheran states. She provided advice on religious policy, facilitated communication between English and German theologians, and helped negotiate the complex diplomatic relationships that shaped English Reformation policy during the 1540s and 1550s. Anne's household became a gathering place for moderate Protestant voices who valued her theological sophistication and her experience of continental reform movements. These informal salons influenced English religious development in ways that traditional political histories have overlooked, as Anne's German perspective provided alternatives to the more radical Protestant positions that dominated official English policy during Edward's reign. Her careful neutrality during the succession crisis that followed Henry's death demonstrated political wisdom that many official courtiers lacked, while others committed themselves to specific factions and risked destruction when political winds shifted. Anne maintained cordial relationships with all parties while avoiding any commitments that might compromise her security or independence. This strategic ambiguity served her well as England lurched between Protestant extremism under Edward and Catholic restoration under Mary, allowing her to survive transitions that destroyed countless others who had chosen sides too early or too definitively. Anne's survival strategy proved its wisdom as Henry's reign grew increasingly unstable and violent. She watched from her safe distance as Catherine Howard was arrested, tried, and executed within 18 months of their wedding. The girl who had been used as a weapon against Anne's dignity became another victim of Henry's murderous impulses, her youth and inexperience providing no protection against royal paranoia and cruelty. The destruction of Catherine Howard served as grim validation of Anne's choice to submit rather than fight. Had Anne resisted the annulment, demanded her rights as queen, or attempted to rally foreign support for her position, she would likely have met the same fate as Henry's fifth wife. Instead, her pragmatic acceptance of humiliation had purchased not just survival, but genuine security in an increasingly dangerous realm where royal favour could transform into deadly hostility without warning or reason. As Henry aged and his health deteriorated further, Anne's position actually improved. The king's attention turned toward his final wife, Catherine Parr, while his earlier marriages faded into uncomfortable memories he preferred to ignore. Anne's quiet dignity during her years of exile had gradually rehabilitated her reputation among courtiers who had once participated in her public humiliation, many of whom now regarded her survival with something approaching admiration. The contrast between Anne's thriving independence and Henry's accelerating decay became increasingly stark as the 1540s progressed. While she built a network of relationships and economic security that would outlast any political upheaval, the king who had rejected her continued his grotesque decline into physical and moral corruption. His leg ulcers had spread and deepened, requiring increasingly desperate medical interventions that only added to his suffering while providing no relief. Court physicians applied poultices containing everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate remedies that reflected the limitations of Tudor medicine and the exceptional measures taken for a patient of Henry's status. The liberal application of opium dulled his pain but further clouded his already deteriorating mind, creating episodes of near delirium where he would ramble about the ghosts of executed rivals or call out for wives long dead. The psychological torment matched the physical. Henry had once been the most feared man in England, his word literally life or death for any subject. Now he found himself helpless against the betrayal of his own flesh, unable to control the very body that had once symbolized royal power and masculine vigor. The man who had blamed Anne for his inadequacies was forced to confront the reality that the corruption had always resided within himself. Meanwhile, Anne's transformation from rejected queen to respected matriarch continued apace. Her correspondence with continental scholars and theologians established her as a significant intellectual figure in her own right, someone whose opinions on religious and political matters carried weight independent of her connection to the English crown. Her translations of German theological works into English influenced Protestant thought in ways that extended far beyond her official status as the king's honorary sister. The economic empire Anne had built through careful investment and shrewd management provided her with resources that many English nobles envied. Her estates had become models of efficient agriculture and enlightened land management, demonstrating innovations that would eventually influence English farming practices for generations. The woman who had been dismissed as a foreign incompetent had proven herself superior to most native English administrators in both vision and execution. Her charitable foundations had created a network of schools, hospitals, and religious institutions that served communities across southern England. These establishments bore her name and carried forward her values, creating a legacy that would outlast the political turmoil of the Tudor succession. While Henry's other wives were remembered primarily for their relationships to the king, Anne was building something entirely her own. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 marked a crucial transition for Anne, though her careful preparation meant she weathered the change better than most courtiers. Unlike many who had tied their fortunes too closely to the dying king's favour, Anne's independence and neutral stance positioned her well for the new reign. Edward VI's Protestant government valued her continental connections and theological expertise, while her reputation for wisdom and discretion made her a trusted figure during the uncertain early years of the boy king's rule. Anne's relationship with Mary Tudor, despite their religious differences, demonstrated her remarkable ability to transcend the sectarian divisions that tore Tudor England apart. Mary respected Anne's intelligence and diplomatic experience, often seeking her counsel on matters involving German states and continental politics. This relationship proved crucial when Mary ascended to the throne in 1553, as Anne's Catholic connections helped protect her during the violent religious reversals that characterized Mary's reign. The funeral arrangements when Anne died peacefully in 1557 reflected the complete transformation of her reputation from object of ridicule to figure of genuine respect and admiration. Her burial in Westminster Abbey was attended by nobility and foreign diplomats who recognized her remarkable journey from humiliated bride to accomplished matriarch. The woman who had been publicly degraded by a diseased tyrant was laid to rest with honors befitting her royal status. More significantly, Anne had achieved something none of Henry's other wives could claim. She had defeated the Tudor king not through confrontation, but through endurance, proving that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in fighting monsters, but in refusing to become one yourself. Her survival represented not just personal triumph, but a moral victory over the forces of tyranny and deception that had defined Henry VIII's reign. The historical legacy of Anne of Cleves has been shaped by centuries of male historians who accepted Henry's narrative without question, perpetuating myths about the inadequate foreign queen who disgusted her royal husband through her own failings. Modern scholarship has begun to pierce through these lies, revealing the truth of a woman who was systematically destroyed by a king whose own body and mind were corrupted beyond redemption. The real stench in the Tudor court came not from Anne's body or clothing, but from Henry's ulcerated legs and diseased soul. The rot that contemporaries whispered about belonged not to the foreign queen, but to the English king, whose vanity and cruelty poisoned everyone around him. In choosing life over martyrdom, Anne achieved something that transcended the immediate circumstances of her Tudor captivity. Her story serves as a testament to the power of strategic thinking, patient endurance, and moral courage in the face of systematic oppression. While Henry VIII rotted from within, consumed by his own corruption and cruelty, Anne of Cleves built a life of dignity, purpose, and genuine achievement that outlasted the tyrant who had tried to destroy her. The woman who had been forced to accept public humiliation as the price of survival ultimately achieved a form of immortality that her tormentor could never claim. Her legacy lived on in the institutions she founded, the people she helped, and the example she set of how grace and intelligence could triumph over brutality and ignorance. In the end, the joke was on Henry VIII, whose diseased body and twisted mind had made him the very thing he had falsely accused Anne of being. The bitter irony of Anne of Cleves' story becomes crystal clear when we examine the final scorecard of this Tudor tragedy. While Henry VIII lay rotting in his tomb at Windsor, his body so bloated with corruption that his lead coffin reportedly burst from the pressure of decomposing gases, Anne continued to thrive in her comfortable estates for another decade. The king who had blamed her for his own physical inadequacies became a literal monument to decay, while the woman he had publicly humiliated built a legacy of genuine achievement and respect. History has finally begun to correct the record, stripping away centuries of lies to reveal the truth. There was indeed a foul stench surrounding this royal marriage, but it never emanated from Anne of Cleves. The corruption, the disease, the moral rot that poisoned everything it touched belonged entirely to Henry VIII himself. His ulcerated legs, his festering wounds, his diseased mind created the very horror he projected onto an innocent woman whose only crime was failing to cure his impotence through magic. Anne's ultimate victory was not just personal, but philosophical. She proved that dignity could survive systematic humiliation, that intelligence could triumph over brute power, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply outliving your enemies while building something beautiful from the ashes of their cruelty. The woman dismissed as inadequate became a model of competence, while the king who rejected her became history's perfect example of absolute power corrupting absolutely. So the next time someone mentions Anne of Cleves as the lucky wife who escaped with her head, remember the full truth. She didn't just survive Henry VIII, she defeated him completely, achieving through patience and wisdom what none of his other queens could accomplish through defiance or submission. In the end, the smell of dead fish that supposedly surrounded Anne of Cleves was nothing more than the projection of a dying tyrant's own putrid soul.